Assalamualaikum, salam hormat. Anda menyaksikan Niaga AWANI bersama saya Harits Asyraf. Kita mulakan dengan laporan pertama di mana Presiden China Xi Jinping bakal diberi sambutan negara dalam satu istiadat yang berlangsung di Istana Negara pagi ini. Beliau yang dalam rangka lawatan negara selama 3 hari di Malaysia akan menghadap Yang di-Pertuan Agong Sultan Ibrahim.
Wisma Putra sebelum ini memaklumkan bahawa Sultan Ibrahim juga berkenan meraihkan Jinping dan delegasinya dalam satu majlis santapan negara. Pada sebelah petang, Jinping yang diiringi menteri-menteri kabinet dan pegawai kanan kerajaan dijadual mengadakan pertemuan dengan Perdana Menteri Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim di Kompleks Seri Perdana Putrajaya. Dalam pertemuan dua hala itu, kedua-dua pemimpin dijangka membincangkan kerjasama dua hala serta bertukar pandangan mengenai isu serantau dan antarabangsa yang menjadi kepentingan bersama. Anwar dan Jinping turut jadual menyaksikan majlis penandatanganan memorandum persefahaman dan bakal menyampaikan kenyataan bersama dua negara. Anwar juga akan menganjurkan majlis makan malam rasmi untuk meraihkan Jinping. Lawatan atas jemputan Sultan Ibrahim itu sebahagian daripada siri lawatan negara pertama Jinping tahun ini yang turut merangkumi Vietnam dan Kemboja. Kali terakhir Presiden China itu mengadakan lawatan negara ke Malaysia ialah pada tahun 2013, menyaksikan kedua-dua negara meningkatkan hubungan diplomatik kepada perkongsian strategik komprehensif. Malaysia dan China telah menjalinkan hubungan diplomatik pada 31 Mei 1974. Kedua-dua negara meraihkan ulang tahun ke-50 hubungan diplomatik pada tahun lepas. Selama 16 tahun berturut-turut sejak 2009, China kekal sebagai rakan dagangan terbesar Malaysia. Jumlah dagangan antara kedua-dua negara bernilai 484.12 bilion ringgit pada 2024, mewakili 16.8% daripada jumlah keseluruhan dagangan global Malaysia, iaitu 2.88 trilion ringgit. Selaku pengerusi ASEAN dan penyelaras negara bagi hubungan dialog ASEAN-China, Malaysia kekal komited untuk terus memperkukuh perkongsian strategik komprehensif antara ASEAN dan China. Menurut Kementerian Luar, usaha berkenaan akan diteruskan melalui dialog, saling mempercayai dan inisiatif yang membawa manfaat kepada rakyat ASEAN dan China.
Baik, dalam menghadapi ketidaktentuan geopolitik global serta perang dagang antara Amerika Syarikat dan China, Malaysia disaran memperkukuh pendirian berkecuali dengan memperkenalkan semula dasar Zone of Peace, Freedom and Neutrality ataupun ZOFAN dalam versi yang lebih segar dan relevan atau ZOFAN 2.0. Pensyarakanan Jabatan Pengajian Antarabangsa dan Strategik Fakulti Sastra dan Sains Sosial Universiti Malaya, Profesor Madya Dr. Roy Anthony Rogers menegaskan konsep ZOFAN yang diperkenalkan Malaysia pada 1971 kini dilihat semakin relevan dalam konteks geopolitik serantau yang kian mencabar.
Balik kepada persoalan tadi yang mana mengenai dalam suasana yang tidak menentu akibat kenaikan tarif oleh pihak Amerika Syarikat dan juga perang dagangan antara Amerika Syarikat dengan China. Pada pandangan saya, Malaysia tidak harus terheret dalam perang perdagangan antara Amerika Syarikat dengan China, kerana Malaysia sebagai sebuah negara perdagangan atau dengan izin a trading nation, kita memerlukan Amerika Syarikat dan juga kita memerlukan China. Malahan bagi saya konsep ZOFAN atau Zone of Peace, Freedom and Neutrality yang telah pun diutarakan oleh Malaysia pada 1971 amat relevan pada hari ini dan tidak keterlaluan kalau saya boleh cadangkan supaya kita meneruskan konsep ZOFAN ini, mungkin ZOFAN 2.0 dalam suasana yang tegang antara Amerika Syarikat dengan China, ataupun orang ada sarjana mengatakan kita telah masuk dalam era Perang Dingin Kedua. Maka ZOFAN ini amat penting untuk memastikan dasar berkecuali dapat diteruskan.
Baik, lawatan rasmi Presiden Xi Jinping bermula semalam sebenarnya dijangka dapat menyeimbangkan nisbah ekspor dan import antara Malaysia dan China. Pengarah Institut Kajian Indonesia, Thailand dan Singapura, Universiti Utara Malaysia Dr. Mat Syukri Shuib memberitahu perdagangan China-Malaysia mengalami defisit kerana negara lebih banyak mengimport dari Beijing berbanding mengeksport.
Menurut Syukri, Pusat Tindakan Geoekonomi Negara NGCC yang ditubuhkan pada 7 April lalu perlu memainkan peranan untuk memperluaskan pasaran Malaysia ke China bagi mengimbangi perdagangan antara kedua-dua negara.
NGCC ni perlu mengambil pengetahuan yang cukup kuat untuk menyeimbangkan apa yang telah dilakukan oleh Trump itu untuk memperkukuhkan hubungan dagang kita dengan China, dan pada masa sama untuk mengimbangkan aspek hubungan dagang supaya kita tidak ada defisit yang meluas antara import dan ekspor Malaysia China itu sendiri.
Perkara ini dilihat berbeza dengan Amerika Syarikat di mana Malaysia mempunyai lebihan dagangan, iaitu negara lebih banyak mengeksport ke Washington berbanding mengimport. Namun landscape berubah apabila Presiden Amerika Syarikat Donald Trump melancarkan tarif timbal balik sebanyak 24% ke atas barangan ekspor Malaysia yang memasuki negara barat itu. Pada masa ini, Trump menggantung tarif timbal balik tersebut selama 90 hari bagi membuka ruang rundingan.
Okey, bercakap soal tarif ini, kita perlu teliti juga penubuhan Pusat Tindakan Geoekonomi Negara NGCC dan nak berkait juga dengan lawatan Presiden China Xi Jinping. Jadi bersama dengan saya pada ketika ini secara dalam talian Profesor Dr. Ahmad Razman yang merupakan pengarah program MBA Putra Business School. Assalamualaikum, selamat pagi Prof. Pertama sekali, kalau kita telitikan, bagaimana sebenarnya Malaysia boleh mengimbangi hubungan dua gergasi ekonomi Amerika Syarikat dan juga China ini? Dan kalau kita lihat dalam rangka lawatan Presiden China pada kali ini, banyak perkara yang mungkin akan dijangka dibincangkan dua pemimpin pada sebelah petang, sebelah pagi ini di Istana Negara. Mungkin apa yang boleh kita faham berkenaan dengan perkara ini dan apa yang boleh kita jangkakan hasil daripada pertemuan kedua-dua pemimpin, termasuk juga apa juga respon dari Amerika Syarikat berhubung dengan perkara ini, Prof?
Haris, apabila kita melihat situasi sekarang, apabila dua gergasi bertembung, kita Malaysia bukan gergasi, tetapi kita haraplah kita jadi macam sang kancil yang kata bijak mengatur strategi tanpa nampak memihak kepada mana-mana pihak. Oleh itu saya melihat pertemuan kali ini amat penting kerana jika kita mengambil tindakan secara melulu ataupun bertindak secara bersendirian, maka amat mudah untuk Amerika Syarikat dalam konteks ini mengambil kesempatan ataupun membuat sesuatu yang akan merugikan kita. Kita lihat bagaimana Vietnam dan juga Cambodia cuba berunding terus dengan Amerika Syarikat dengan menawarkan kadar tarif yang rendah kepada Amerika Syarikat. Vietnam 0%, Cambodia 5%. Tapi kita lihat Amerika Syarikat terus menolak tawaran tersebut. Tetapi apabila kita dilihat melakukan perbincangan dulu dengan China dan kita sebagai pengerusi ASEAN akan berbincang dengan rakan serantau kita ini sebelum berbincang dengan Amerika Syarikat, maka sudah tentu Amerika Syarikat akan melihat kita bukannya satu negara yang mudah dibuli, tetapi akan mewakili satu kuasa ekonomi yang besar di rantau Asia, terutama di Asia Tenggara, dan juga kita juga boleh membawa suara China kerana pada masa ini Amerika Syarikat dan China tidak berhubung secara langsung, tetapi apabila Presiden Xi Jinping datang ke sini, sudah tentu Amerika Syarikat juga ingin tahu apabila kita datang berbincang mewakili ASEAN dengan Amerika Syarikat nanti, sudah tentu dia juga mahu melihat apakah peranan China dalam konteks perundingan ini. Tetapi yang paling penting ialah menunjukkan bahawa kita adalah negara yang mengamalkan sistem ekonomi terbuka. Kita tidak memihak kepada mana-mana pihak dari segi politik dan kita bersedia untuk mengadakan hubungan perdagangan dengan mana-mana negara, dan itulah mesej yang perlu disampaikan di samping kita ada perbincangan dengan China pada masa ini.
Prof, bercakap soal NGCC, National Geoeconomic Action Council ini, bagaimana majlis ini yang mesyuaratnya berlangsung Isnin lalu, apa mungkin hasil utama dan peranan NGCC ini supaya mungkin rakyat di luar sana lebih faham dari segi merangka strateginya dan juga nak memastikan sebagai Malaysia sebuah ekonomi terbuka dan juga negara perdagangan ini, kita boleh strike the balance lah antara Amerika Syarikat dan juga China dapat berbincang dan juga memastikan win-win situation dapat dibawa dan akhirnya ianya tidak memaksa rakyat untuk menanggung kos yang mungkin inflasi akan mencanak akibat daripada pertembungan dua gergasi ini, Prof.
Ya, saya melihat NGCC ni lebih bersifat macam task force, iaitu harus mengambil maklum atas perkembangan yang berlaku saban hari dan juga mengambil keputusan yang kata tidak ketinggalan lah dari segi konteks apabila kita melihat Amerika Syarikat sentiasa mengubah dia punya keputusan. Dan juga kalau kita lihat ianya tidak berdasarkan konsensus ataupun perundingan dengan mana pihak, tetapi ianya diambil secara berterusan ataupun secara langsung daripada Presiden sendiri. Oleh itu, apabila kita berdepan dengan situasi yang memang tidak menentu, yang kita tidak boleh jangka, perlu ada NGCC yang akan menilai situasi yang berlaku setiap hari dan memberi cadangan ataupun tindakan susulan kepada kerajaan untuk bertindak pada masa yang sesuai dengan tindakan yang sesuai. Jadi saya lihat NGCC ini penting kerana kita tidak boleh menggunakan platform mesyuarat ataupun perbincangan yang sedia ada yang mungkin berbentuk berkala, tetapi NGCC ini harus bersifat lebih kepada task force yang boleh diadakan mesyuarat dia mengikut keperluan yang mendesak.
Ya, Prof, lagi satu perkara, strategi China campur satu ataupun China plus one ini, nampaknya syarikat-syarikat multinasional mula melihat ataupun sudah melaksanakan strategi China plus one ini. Bagaimana respon Prof melihat kepada perkara ini? Adakah mungkin China akan mula terasa terkesan ataupun China akan melihat bahawa okey, terbuka, tak apa, mungkin kita akan ada rakan-rakan yang lebih strategik selepas ini menerusi strategi China plus one ini, Prof?
Ya, memang kita lihat banyak syarikat multinasional sudah mula melaksanakan strategi China Plus One, iaitu meletak ataupun mewujudkan dan juga melabur lah sebenarnya di negara-negara lain selain daripada China. Tetapi kalau kita lihat Amerika Syarikat sekarang pun mereka sudah mula mahu memastikan bahawa strategi ini juga dilakukan oleh mereka, iaitu mana-mana negara yang bekerjasama dengan China untuk menghasilkan barangan yang diambil daripada China ataupun komponen China turut juga disekat untuk penjualan ke Amerika Syarikat. Oleh itu saya melihat dalam konteks sudut China itu sendiri, mereka melihat strategi ini juga boleh membantu mereka untuk tidak semestinya mendebusi ataupun mengekalkan perdagangan dengan Amerika Syarikat, tetapi lebih kepada meluaskan pasaran untuk China itu sendiri supaya tidak terlalu bergantung kepada Amerika Syarikat. Bermakna syarikat-syarikat ini berlabur katakanlah di Malaysia. Tetapi tidak semestinya China masuk ke Malaysia membuka kilang untuk pasaran Amerika Syarikat semata-mata, tetapi untuk pasaran di Asia Pasifik dan sebagainya. Itu yang saya nampak kemungkinan apa yang China akan ambil pendekatan.
Ya, satu lagi perkara, Prof, kalau kita meneliti melihat kepada dengan berlakunya pengalihan perdagangan ataupun trade diversion akibat daripada ketegangan geopolitik dan juga perubahan dasar global ini, adakah Malaysia sudah bersedia dari segi dasarnya, infrastrukturnya, termasuk juga bakat untuk menjadi destinasi pilihan pelabur asing, terutama dalam apa yang dinyatakan oleh Prof, nak mempelbagaikan pasaran menembusi ke benua-benua yang lain yang mungkin untapped potential yang sebelum ini kita nampak potensi tapi kita tidak pernah pergi ke pasaran-pasaran tersebut, Prof?
Ya, kita memang di landasan yang terbaik untuk melaksanakan ini kerana pertama dari segi infrastruktur kita sudah hampir kata melengkapi inisiatif Road and Belt Strategy itu, macam SRL ni dia boleh sambung kepada laluan kereta api ke Thailand, Laos terus ke China. Dan juga kita lihat dari segi bakat, kita ada banyak modal insan dalam sektor semikonduktor. Kalau kita tengok 2-3 tahun kebelakang ini, banyak syarikat yang berteknologi tinggi, terutama dalam bidang E&E, sudah mula membuat pelaburan jangka masa panjang. Dan kalau kita lihat dari segi polisi, kita memang mesra pelabur. Dan di situ saya lihat kita sebenarnya lebih jauh ke depan berbanding negara ASEAN yang lain. Kalau kita tengok walaupun Singapura dia negara maju tetapi dia lebih kepada perkhidmatan. Tetapi sektor yang kita boleh betul-betul ambil orang kata kelebihan di sini selain daripada sektor E&E adalah satu lagi sektor yang saya lihat berpotensi besar iaitu nadir bumi dan juga teknologi digital lah seperti AI, hybrid, tenaga hijau dan sebagainya. Dan kita memang bersedia kerana saya tengok sejak dalam 5 tahun ini pembangunan infrastruktur yang kita fokuskan dari segi Iskandar, region, Pengerang sehinggalah kepada pembangunan di utara di Penang terutamanya, dan kali ini selepas ISRL dilaksanakan turut merangkumi wilayah timur. Dan di situ saya lihat kelebihan yang kita ada ni belum lagi dapat ditandingi oleh mana-mana negara ASEAN lain, dan itulah yang kita harapkan menjadi orang kata first mover advantage untuk menjadi orang kata alternatif kepada syarikat-syarikat untuk melabur di sini untuk membuka lebih banyak pasaran selain daripada Amerika Syarikat.
Prof, antara satu perkara yang kita tahu perundingan dengan Amerika Syarikat masih lagi dijalankan dan juga pada ketika ini Xi Jinping juga berada di Malaysia dan juga ada tekanan dari Amerika Syarikat menyatakan bahawa seolah-olah apabila Presiden Xi Jinping turun ke lapangan ke negara-negara ini, negara-negara yang dilawati ini ibarat bersekongkol lah memihak kepada China. Tapi mungkin apa bentuk langkah diplomatik dan ekonomi yang diambil oleh Malaysia bagi memastikan bahawa keterlibatan aktif dalam kedua-dua blok China dan juga Amerika Syarikat tanpa mengorbankan kepentingan negara dalam jangka panjang ini, Prof?
Ya, kita memang harus sentiasa meletakkan pendirian kita bahawa kita adalah negara yang berkecuali, kita terbuka untuk berbincang dengan mana-mana pihak. Apabila kita meletakkan ini, sudut pandangan ini, maka tidak harus kita menolak. Sebagai contoh, lawatan daripada Presiden Xi Jinping, kita harus menerima. Bagaimana kalau Trump nak datang ke Malaysia pun kita harus terima.
Betul.
Dan itulah mesej yang perlu diberikan bahawa menerima kunjungan mana-mana pemimpin tidak bermakna kita tunduk kepada mereka, tetapi ini adalah mesej keterbukaan kita.
Betul.
Dan kalau kita nak tengok dari segi adakah ini akan menyebabkan kita akan sedikit terkesan apabila melakukan perbincangan dengan Amerika Syarikat, itulah pentingnya apabila kita pergi berbincang nanti, kita mewakili suara rantau ASEAN dan tidak mewakili Malaysia semata-mata. Dan dan Amerika Syarikat tidak akan mengambil tindakan kepada kita semata-mata kerana dia akan melihat kita sebenarnya membawa suara serantau, dan itu yang penting kita lakukan, iaitu sentiasa meletakkan pendirian kita sebagai orang kata bebas dan juga terbuka untuk berdagang dengan mana-mana pihak.
Okey. Baik, terima kasih Profesor Dr. Ahmad Razman, pengarah program MBA Putra Business School, berkongsi pandangan beliau, dan insyaAllah dari semasa ke semasa kita akan terus bersiaran, termasuklah melihat apa yang akan dinyatakan oleh kedua-dua pemimpin dalam pertemuan pada sebelah petang di Pejabat Perdana Menteri ataupun di Kompleks Sri Perdana pada sebelah petang nanti. Itu juga yang akan dinantikan di peringkat global. Terima kasih sekali lagi, Prof. Niaga Awani, kita nak berhenti rehat seketika. Kita akan memberi tumpuan kepada pilihan raya Singapura selepas ini.
Puan Dana, can you explain to me what just happened? Is he gone? Ini memang nak kena betul lah.
Sendoi, you habis kalah lagi. 70,000 ringgit now.
Oh, why are men like this? This time, I had a trick.
Dia.
Orang yang paling bahaya adalah orang yang paling dekat dengan kita. Any last words?
Betul. Okay, saya yakin Diana tu suspek, Chief.
Kita campak dia dulu. Kalau dia okey, baru kita terjun. What? Dan takkan ada siapa-siapa lagi yang boleh kontrol kita. Kita jahanamkan dia orang semua.
You know I can help you, right?
I nak pecah. Minyak pun habis.
First Wives. Stream episod terbaru dahulu, eksklusif on demand dan 9 malam di Astro Citra.
Uniform Tentera Darat Malaysia TADM bagi peserta program latihan khidmat negara tidak seharusnya menjadi isu hangat.
Jenayah penipuan pelaburan mencatatkan jumlah kerugian tertinggi pada tahun ini setakat 2 Februari lalu.
Kementerian Pendidikan memandang serius isu peningkatan trend penggunaan rokok elektronik.
Lembaga Lebuh Raya Malaysia LLM memperluaskan larangan kenderaan berat memasuki lebuh raya pada waktu puncak di beberapa jajaran terpilih di sekitar Lembah Kelam.
Penyasaran subsidi diesel di Semenanjung tidak akan memberi kesan kepada harga barangan keperluan di Sabah, Sarawak dan Labuan.
660 individu berusia bawah 21 tahun di Sarawak telah diberikan kewarganegaraan.
Sarawak kini menjalinkan kerjasama dengan Bank Dunia dalam menjayakan perdagangan karbonnya.
Kenapa tiba-tiba aku rasa jealous dengan Kak Nur ni?
Cubaan memikat hati.
Kenapa abang nak orang macam Kak Nur?
Kak Nur tu cukup sempurna dah untuk abang.
Abang tak kisah Nur tak boleh balik dengan anak.
Abang tak kisah pun. Asalkan abang ada Nur, itu dah cukup.
Tapi Kak Nur kisah abang. Abang tolonglah dia.
Macam mana?
Gimana sanggup untuk jadi isteri nombor 2 abang?
Apakah takdir mereka? 1000 tahun, Rabu dan Khamis, 9 malam di Astro Ria dan Astro Go. Inilah acara kemuncak yang dinanti-nantikan. Pertembungan epik JDT Sri Pahang. Perlawanan akhir Piala Malaysia demi sebuah takhta legenda. Sri Pahang mendapati Johor Darul Taksim berada di hadapan. Sokonglah sepenuhnya demi Liga kita. Perlawanan akhir Piala Malaysia secara langsung di Astro dan Astro Go. Ayo gemuruhkan serangan sang juara.
Welcome back to Niaga AWANI. Singaporeans will head to polls on 3rd May for the country's 14th general election after President Tharman Shanmugaratnam dissolved Parliament yesterday. Nomination day will be on 23rd April. The upcoming contest will be the first under Prime Minister Lawrence Wong, who was sworn in last May, and Singapore's fourth generation 4G leadership team. To discuss further on the upcoming election and what to expect, with me right now is Professor Chandra Mugan Tanggavelu, head of the Jeffrey Chia Institute on Southeast Asia at Sunway University. First of all, Prof, thank you so much for being with us. Professor, how credible is Prime Minister Lawrence Wong's call for a renewed mandate when public sentiment, according to recent polls, suggests widespread dissatisfaction with the government's measures on cost of living?
Thank you for having me here. There are several different dimensions into this. One dimension is, of course, the cost of living, but the new dimension that's added to this equation is the uncertainty that has developed from the Trump reciprocal tariff itself. Mm-hmm. So in terms of rising costs, Singapore has been experiencing the rising costs for the last decade or so, even after the global financial crisis.
Right.
So fairly the government has put in measures to actually measure and manage the rising costs in terms of supporting the vulnerable group and the vulnerable population, the older workers, the unskilled workers, they have the future skills. So these are dimensions they already put in fairly to give the stability that Singapore requires to maintain its developed status. And so fairly developed status will converge to 3% growth. And if they get anything more, it's a bonus, but fairly they know that they can maintain that with the policies they put in, the policies for harmonizing the rising cost itself. But the new dimension of the Trump tariff has raised the issue of global uncertainty and the way we're going to grow, the next phase. And the growth will have an important implication for how we're going to support the rising cost itself. Mm-hmm. So that's the reason why they thought that calling it earlier is one good strategy that allows them to maintain their mandate and improve their mandate. Hopefully, they can improve their mandate themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Professor, in what ways can the PAP justify its 124 billion Sing dollars spending plans as effective economic relief and rather than election time populism, especially when critics argue that such handouts may be fueling inflation instead of curbing it?
That's a good question. The question is how to mitigate the rising costs itself. But any social protection policies or any social policies are not meant to drive up inflation, but actually to give the social inclusion and the social protection that the vulnerable group needs.
Mm-hmm.
So the benefits and the social protection or the social inclusion policies they put in includes the training of workers, including the future skills training framework itself, and including to cover other important living costs and other elements itself. So having said that, how it will drive up price or how it will manage the rising costs itself becomes important question, because there's a trade-off. The trade-off is I need to protect my people from the rising costs, so I need to provide these subsidies and social protection in not just purely from the demand side, but also from the supply side.
Yeah.
The future skills is about the supply side subsidies to increase the competitiveness of workers themselves. And of course, on the demand side, how they're going to manage that will be important to see how the demand side might stroke some inflationary effects.
Yeah.
So they have to balance both in terms of how they're going to provide the social protection itself. So it's an election budget anyway. So as an election budget, you expect a little bit more than a normal budget itself.
Yeah, Professor, given Singapore's vulnerability to external shocks, how equipped is Lawrence Wong's fourth generation leadership team to recalibrate the nation's economic model amid a weakening global trade regime and also rising of protectionism? Your thoughts on this, Prof?
Thank you. That's again a very good question. As I mentioned, the first phase of social protection that come after the global financial crisis was fairly to stabilize and create a more balanced dimension in the economy itself.
Yep.
But with the Trump reciprocal tariff, it has changed the way we're going to grow next, especially how a small economy like Singapore is going to grow. Because if they dismantle the rule-based trading area, and Singapore thrive on a rule base, from manufacturing to services, and even in terms of human capital, multinationals, the rule base is very important for them. So how Singapore is going to gravitate and restructure itself in the rule-based trading framework is going to be very critical for us. So fairly, that's why ASEAN is important. ASEAN centrality is important. And currently, Singapore has a free trade with US. So it still can use the US free trade, but fairly that is going to take a long time to resolve. And then we have the ASEAN, the largest global trading bloc within us, and Singapore can play an important role in that framework in terms of digital, green economy, and even skills, and even more 21st century issues can be addressed. And of course, we also have the ASEAN +1 FTAs as a region itself. So fairly, there are key landing points they can use to create a new architecture. So the new team have to think about the new architecture they have to develop and to frame in terms of, as a developed country, what are the avenues they have and how to use the fundamentals to actually increase the competitiveness itself. So the new team that Prime Minister Lawrence Wong is putting out is quite interesting. More young people, more civil servants, the party. And it's also interesting to see how the opposition will put up a strong front, because it has opened up a different dimension of how we're going to manage the growth itself.
Yeah, Professor, with the balance around 2 minutes of our discussion, amid recent corruption scandals and political controversies affecting both ruling and opposition parties, how much trust do voters still place in Singapore's political institution, and will this erosion of trust impact PAP's historic dominance in this election, Prof?
That's a good question. The good question is, the issue of corruption has emerged in the Singapore political scenario. But the interesting part about this is the government wants to handle this in a very transparent way.
Yeah.
And in terms of a rule-based and legal way to handle the corruption issue itself, which actually shows that any developed country with a strong institution is still going to see corruption itself. But having said that, there are issues that are more fundamental than corruption that is going to be very critical for Singapore. The living cost, as rightly pointed out, and public housing is reaching very high prices. That will be another contention. And aging population and how we can go to retain our wealth will also be very important discussion other than corruption itself. So these will be the key election points that will be played out in the election itself.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Chandra Mugan Tanggavelu, Head of the Jeffrey Chia Institute on Southeast Asia at Sunway University, for your thoughts and ideas. And of course, Niaga Awani, Astro AWANI will bring you more updates on Singapore's 14th general election. Okey, baik, kita nak teruskan dengan perbincangan melihat kepada isu cyber, di mana kalau kita telitikan ancaman cyber yang semakin meluas dan perlunya benteng yang kukuh untuk Malaysia terutamanya menepani cabaran cyber yang semakin maju ini. Jadi bersama dengan saya di studio pada ketika ini tidak asing lagi saudara Muhammad Sirajuddin Jalil, Presiden Persatuan Pengguna Cyber Malaysia. Siraj, terima kasih sudah hadir ke Astro AWANI. Belum terlambat lagi nak ucap selamat Hari Raya. Selamat Hari Raya. Okey. Pertama sekali kalau kita bercakap berkenaan dengan ancaman cyber ini, kalau kita telitikan kerugian $12.8 bilion Amerika yang sudah tahun lepas sebenarnya satu yang perkara yang mengejutkan, satu angka yang cukup besar dengan kalau kita lihat ini mencerminkan kelemahan. Adakah, soalan pertama saya, adakah itu mencerminkan kelemahan dalam kita nak bergerak maju ke hadapan dengan jumlah kerugian sebesar $12.8 bilion Amerika ini? Adakah sebenarnya kita masih lagi keterbelakang dalam nak meletak benteng pertahanan itu? Siraj,
3% KDNK nilainya sangat besar dan juga kalau letakkan nilai itu sebagai satu industri, dia adalah satu industri yang sepatutnya memberi peluang pekerjaan yang cukup banyak. Tetapi angka itu sebenarnya bukan memberi peluang pekerjaan tapi meragut nilai kewangan rakyat yang cukup banyak. Jadi apabila kita menyentuh tentang isu keselamatan cyber di kalangan pengguna rakyat Malaysia, isu ini bukan lagi isu yang boleh difikir oleh hanya sebahagian pihak pemikir. Dia sudah masuk dalam fasa yang menjadi elemen keselamatan negara kita. Dan juga dia menjadi sepatutnya asas kepada semua rakyat Malaysia, baik ibu bapa, baik rakyat dalam industri pekerjaan dan juga khusus dalam konteks hari ini perbincangan. Saya akan lebih menjurus kepada soal pendidikan. Kerana pendidikan itu menjadi tunjang kepada sikap. Daripada sikap itu baru pendidikan itu menjadi tunjang kepada kesedaran. Dan kesedaran itu membentuk sikap. Jadi rantaian ini belum ada dalam aspek keselamatan cyber dalam negara kita, di mana asas pendidikan itu mungkin pada tahun 1990-an telah pun diperkenalkan literasi komputer. Tetapi hari ini konteks literasi digital sudah berubah dan berbeza. Waktu itu literasi komputer mungkin lebih kepada menggalakkan rakyat Malaysia menggunakan teknologi. Hari ini kita perlu sedar bahawa menggunakan teknologi bukan menjadi isu lagi. Sebab seawal 1 tahun anak-anak dah didedahkan dengan tablet dan sebagainya. Hari ini perkara terpenting yang patut ada dalam sistem pendidikan negara adalah literasi digital yang mengarah kepada pemikiran keselamatan. Saya memetik ayat pemikiran keselamatan daripada Dr. Nirwandi, UiTM. Dia pernah di AWANI ini bercakap tentang pemikiran keselamatan. Pemikiran keselamatan hari ini perlu ada dilahirkan daripada aspek pendidikan literasi digital yang perlu ada di peringkat sekolah, baik sekolah rendah maupun sekolah menengah.
Betul, saya rasa zaman saya sekolah dulu betul ada subjek ETS dan sebagainya, mengajar nak menggunakan nak mengaplikasi teknologi komputer itu, tapi sekarang ini perubahannya itu perlu dilakukan. Jadi dari segi kesediaan, adakah Siraj memandang bahawa kerajaan meletakkan ataupun kita berada di landasan yang tepat dalam nak memberi pendidikan dan ilmu itu dalam mendepani cabaran ini?
Haris, saya berpandangan benda tu dah ada dalam menu. Okay. Kita pergi restoran dah ada dalam menu. Soal kita nak makan apa,
nak order apa ni?
Pilih. Sebab dalam dasar pendidikan digital negara kita telah pun dinyatakan tentang kepentingan literasi digital. Okay. Bukan hanya di Malaysia, bahkan Malaysia merujuk kepada framework yang ada, dasar yang ada di peringkat ASEAN, betul, bahkan di peringkat EU, bahkan di peringkat Pertubuhan Bangsa-Bangsa Bersatu. Kerangka literasi digital ataupun Digital Literacy Framework telah pun diterbitkan oleh pihak UNESCO. Cukup terperinci, Haris. Daripada kosong senggatannya hingga ke kerangka ke-6. Merangkumi soal tentang bagaimana awal ilmu menggunakan peranti, kemudian masuk kepada bagaimana ilmu tentang menghadam maklumat dalam dunia internet, termasuk platform media sosial, beralih kepada bagaimana kemahiran untuk ataupun pengetahuan tentang menghasilkan kandungan, ke tahap bagaimana tentang keselamatan, merangkumi soal keselamatan kita melibatkan kesihatan, termasuk juga soal kita punya kerjaya terkait tentang teknologi. Jadi ukuran itu telah pun wujud dalam ilmu tentang literasi digital. Walau bagaimanapun ia kurang ataupun tidak jelas di peringkat pelaksanaan, di peringkat sekolah menengah ataupun di peringkat sekolah rendah. That's why di peringkat Persatuan Pengguna Siber Malaysia kita berharap, bahkan kami telah pun melakukan satu inisiatif di Negeri Sembilan. Ada 3 sekolah insya-Allah minggu depan kita mulakan usaha bersama dengan Yayasan Negeri Sembilan untuk melaksanakan program secara ringkas, padat, mudah diduplikasi, iaitu program mendidik literasi digital dan juga kepimpinan digital di kalangan sekolah rendah dan juga menengah. Ada 3 sekolah pilot inisiatif kami dan juga kerajaan negeri, supaya dia menjadi titik tolak untuk melihat pendidikan itu ada. Sebab kalau tak ada pendidikan, Haris, kita kena ingat zaman merdeka kita. Kalaulah leluhur kita tidak menekankan tentang kepentingan pendidikan kepada kita, kita takkan rasa negara kita hari ini, Haris. That's why saya selalu ingatkan bahawa pendidikan menjadi tunjang kepada kecelaruan. Kecelaruan yang tidak ditunjangi pendidikan, maka kita akan terus menghasilkan kecelaruan. That's what we call it dunia cyber. Dasar kerajaan yang menggalakkan kita menggunakan digital, pembayaran tanpa tunai, menggalakkan seperti penjawat awam untuk menggunakan AI tanpa ada pemahaman. Contohnya, apakah indeks literasi digital kita? Kita bercakap tentang ramai yang jadi mangsa scam. Apakah literasi indeks literasi digital dalam negara kita? Betul. Indeks literasi digital di kalangan penjawat awam. Berapa peratus sebenarnya penjawat awam yang faham pun tentang keselamatan?
Contoh pesara sebagai contoh. Pesara. Jadi, yang selalu jadi mangsa scam ni.
Dan mungkin hasil daripada pendidikan, satu sistem dibuat. Mungkin ada satu mekanisme macam kita exam sejarah lah, Haris. Kalau kita tanya, awak sejarah dapat apa? Saya dapat E. Maknanya kita tahu sama dia malas belajar, tak pergi sekolah. Dan kalau dia tak tahu siapa Perdana Menteri pertama kita, maknanya kita tahu. Dia memang orang yang buta sejarah. Tapi kalau hari ini kita cakap dia tentang tak kena scam, kita nak salahkan dia 100% pun tak boleh, sebab pihak kerajaan bertanggungjawab menyediakan pengetahuan kepada dia. Walaupun usaha sesetengah pihak independen, maknanya secara peribadi mencari maklumat, itu bagus. Tetapi mengharapkan sandaran independen itu dalam struktur membangunkan kerangka negara kita ini sehingga ke tahap merugikan 3% KDNK itu tak boleh, Haris. Kita perlu meletakkan satu cara yang lebih sistematik. Jadi apa caranya? Kita perlu mengukur seawal mungkin satu generasi. Tahun ini cantik, Haris. Sebab semua sekolah rendah adalah Gen Alpha.
Betul.
Semua pelajar sekolah adalah batch akhir generasi Z. Dan tahun ini inilah kelahiran generasi beta. Jadi kalau melihat pada senggatan generasi, kerajaan mengambil usaha untuk menyusun ayat reform tu. Reformasikan sistem pendidikan selari dengan hasrat kerajaan untuk mendigitalkan segala benda. Jadi kalau ada sistem pendidikan yang cantik, maknanya mereka ni secara tak langsung juga, Aris, anak-anak kepada pasangan ibu bapa. Mereka boleh menjadi organic sub-agent, menjadi sub-agent memberi pencerahan kepada ibu bapa. Ingat kempen merokok. Kalau di sekolah ada, kemudian balik ke rumah, anak-anak akan nasihat ibu bapa. Cikgu cakap jangan hisap rokok. Sebab kat sekolah ada ajar jangan hisap rokok. Jadi ibu bapa akan malu sendiri. Dan ibu bapa juga boleh menjadi kan anak mereka sumber ilmu untuk mereka tanya sekolah belajar apa. Jadi bayangkan hari ini internet balik ke rumah, saya yakin majoriti rakyat Malaysia dengan kadar penembusan internet kita lebih 90%. Betul. Bahkan kadar penembusan media sosial pun lebih 90% hari ini, Haris. That's why kami menekankan soal pendidikan. Saya yakin ada perbincangan baru ni dibuat melibatkan beberapa pihak yang menghasilkan kajian yang seperti kita sebut tadi. Ada 4 perkara domain disebut tentang advokasi, tentang menyusun tentang perkara. Bagi saya enforcement tentang akta itu sudah cukup.
Betul.
Ada akta kesempatan siber. Ditambah tahun ini kerajaan nak buat akta jenayah cyber. Cukup dah. Kita tak nak sampai banyak sangat enforcement, akta terlalu banyak, akhirnya orang keliru. Orang tak faham apa kaedah itu. Yang penting pendidikan. Tanpa pendidikan membentuk pengguna yang jahil. Pengguna yang jahil, maka apa yang kita harapkan daripada mereka? Masalah ialah Haris.
Kerugian lebih besar lah.
Kerugian lebih besar. Dan ini terbukti saban tahun. Kita jangan harap masa COVID je. Tapi hari ini tak COVID pun makin ramai makin kena scam.
Siraj, tapi kalau kita bercakap dalam konteks kerugian ini, adakah ianya sedikit sebanyak mencetuskan rasa mungkin dalam kalangan mereka yang pesara ke, warga emas ke, yang mungkin merasakan tak payahlah nak scan QR, saya go to conventional way, contoh macam saya bayar by cash lah, tak naklah digital ni, takutlah kena jadi mangsa scam, sehingga ianya melambatkan proses transformasi digital itu. Adakah Siraj merasakan sebegitu mungkin akan menyebabkan langkah kita nak move forward, tapi mungkin disebabkan oleh rasa takut, kerugian yang tinggi ini dan sebagainya, dia sedikit melambatkan progres itu, Siraj?
Dalam banyak usaha kempen ataupun pendidikan kesedaran yang kami buat, ada dua perbezaan outcome daripada pengguna bila kita ataupun daripada pendengar lah, bila kita berkongsi. Bila bercakap, mereka cuba faham tapi kesedaran belum cukup. Tetapi bila kami tonjolkan bagaimana penggodaman berlaku terhadap peranti dia, bagaimana proses scam itu secara realiti dilihat di depan mata mereka, kesedarannya meningkat berbeza, Haris. That's why ada satu teori komunikasi dipanggil protection motivation theory. Protection motivation theory ini menekankan soal apabila satu ancaman itu dilihat secara nyata, akan mengakibatkan pengguna itu kesedarannya meningkat ke tahap tertinggi. Dan kerisauan itu menjadi elemen advokasi paling berkesan dalam aspek jenayah. Sebab bila jenayah kita tengok dalam filem banyak digambarkan tentang tindakan membunuh contoh. Jadi orang tahu membunuh itu satu perbuatan yang sangat bahaya dan dibunuh apatah lagi, meragut nyawa. Jadi dalam konteks jenayah cyber, dia ada rantaian, dan jenayah cyber bukan hanya soal scam.
Betul.
Ada jenis jenayah cyber yang membawa kepada maut. Seperti cyberbully. Ada jenayah cyber yang boleh meranapkan satu organisasi ke tahap ground zero.
Betul.
Hanya melalui meruntuhkan reputasi mereka. Jadi itu adalah aspek yang multi effect. Cuma banyak mangsa hanya terasa jadi mangsa apabila mereka betul-betul jadi mangsa. Kemudian kesedarannya menjadi tinggi. Dan ada pula, Haris, bahayanya penjenayah cyber ni, pattern sekarang dia pergi scam lagi bangsa scam. Mana Haris kalau dah kena scam hari ni, dia akan jalan, dia scam lagi. Sekiranya dia tahu Haris ada lagi duit baki. Jadi pattern sebegini penjenayah cyber ni, dia hati perut tak ada. Dia akan buat macam mana pula?
Dia tahu situ lubuk lah.
Kemudian dia tahu orang kena scam ni panik, nak cari jalan nak dapatkan balik duit dia. Dia datangkan dengan tawaran, dia boleh selesaikan tapi kena bayar. Bayar pun kena scam lagi. Jadi social engineering, mereka penjenayah cyber ini bukan hanya mengkaji soal kelompongan sistem, tetapi mengkaji kelompongan sikap pengguna. That's why rantaian ini, kecelaruan ini perlu diselesaikan semula dalam satu sistem pendidikan, Haris. Saya akan kerap banyak cakap pasal benda ni. Sebab kita pernah cakap tentang akta. Alhamdulillah kerajaan Madani ini dah buat akta itu. Dan ada banyak pula akta dipinda dan sebagainya. Kita bercakap soal tentang kempen kesedaran. Saya yakin semua pihak dalam Malaysia ini, baik perbankan, baik media, khususnya AWANI ini, pelbagai jenis kempen dah dibuat. Tetapi kita lihat outcome-nya apa? Meningkat lagi. Jadi apa yang kita tertinggal? Dalam membentuk puzzle, satu puzzle yang kalau di peringkat kami lihat lompongnya jelas, iaitu pendidikan. Kita masih gagal lagi meletakkan satu rujukan asas dalam masyarakat di mana kita nak tengok ilmu itu tersusun. Hari ini tak ada jawapan, Haris. Kalau tanya kita sendiri, kat mana? dekat CSM ke, dekat NAKSA ke?
Betul.
Adakah NAKSA yang menyediakan pendidikan kat kita yang kita kena wajib ikut?
Follow yang tu.
Tidak ada jawapannya. Jadi kita nak satu generasi yang jelas unjuran ke depan itu bukan meningkatkan kadar, menurunkan kadar. Kalau warga senior, mungkin ada satu objek alternatif boleh dibuat kerana tak boleh mewajibkan. Kecuali kalau kerajaan hari ini cukup ada iltizam yang kuat, mereka mungkin boleh keluarkan satu general public examination on membentuk berapakah bacaan kesedaran kita. Kalau itu dapat dibuatkan, saya yakin indeks literasi digital juga dapat diterbitkan kerana indeks itu belum wujud dalam negara kita.
Okey, itu sebenarnya yang kita boleh gambarkan dan juga boleh kita harapkan. Tapi Siraj, kita dah sampai di penghujung perbincangan ini. InsyaAllah dari semasa ke semasa kita akan terus bersiaran dan juga kita akan terus memberi fokus serta tumpuan seperti yang Siraj katakan, indeks literasi itu juga memainkan peranan yang penting, termasuk bagaimana inisiatif pasukan Siraj sendiri menerusi MCCA dengan sekolah-sekolah sebenarnya untuk memberi pendidikan kepada generasi muda, dan generasi muda itu sebenarnya boleh bagi nasihat kepada ibu bapa atau nenek mereka, boleh nasihat bagaimana nak memastikan bahawa benteng siber itu dapat dikukuhkan. Terima kasih saudara Muhammad Sirajuddin Jalil, Presiden Persatuan Pengguna Siber Malaysia. Sekian laporan niaga AWANI untuk waktu ini. Selepas ini WEF ada expert explanation dan juga bagaimana update dari segi ASEAN selepas ini menerusi ASEAN kita.
Global economy.
The global economy.
The global economy.
The global economy.
Global economy.
The global economy.
The global economy has entered a phase of unprecedented uncertainty.
People don't seem to realize that we really are in the midst of this massive transformation.
So what's driving this change? And how will major forces like trade shifts, changing demographics, and artificial intelligence shape our fast-moving world?
Yes, we see some geo-economic fragmentation, but we don't see yet any deglobalization.
We've asked some of the world's leading chief economists, working in both the private and public sectors, to look ahead and pick the trends they think will transform the economy as we know it.
It's not that AI is new or machine learning is new. In fact, we all know that it goes back to the 1950s. What's new is the consumer orientation of that AI.
These experts explain. The first trend that's on economists' minds is the changing nature of global trade. Trade is all about the exchange of goods and services. This process might seem as natural to our globalized world as travel or sending an instant message.
If I had to make all of my clothes, all of my food, all of my housing, all of my shelter, and so on by myself personally, clearly this would be a disaster. So what do? I specialize in something, you specialize in something, and we exchange. I think it stands to reason that this is the absolute fundamental pillar of our prosperity. Now, international trade is just an extension of this very basic idea across international borders.
But who trades with whom can be closely linked to geopolitics. Tariffs and protectionism are redrawing the map of globalization. They're causing what economists call fragmentation, where the world economy splits into competing groups instead of a single connected system. Chief economists agree that protectionism, a practice of restricting imports from other countries through tariffs, will cause a long-lasting change to global patterns over the next 3 years.
But what we do see is trade reorienting around geopolitical lines. This is most obvious in the relationship between China and the United States. Since the first wave of Trump tariffs from the previous administration, the trade share, so bilateral trade between China and the United States has grown much more slowly than trade between either of these countries and third countries.
When the WTO looked at the voting behavior of the UN General Assembly, it found that members were more likely to trade with countries they regarded as allies, a practice otherwise known as friendshoring. In the first quarter of 2025, the changing dynamics of trade relations between major powers like the US, China, the EU, Canada, and Mexico dominated the news. OSA says it remains to be seen whether trade tensions, particularly between the US and China, will lead to further fragmentation among other countries.
One figure that most people don't know is that bilateral trade between China and the United States actually only accounts for less than 3% of world trade. So it generates 80% of the news, but only 3% of world trade, if you will. So I think it's safe to predict that trade tensions between these two countries are going to persist. I think the key question is this going to spread to other countries, or is this going to be contained to that bilateral relationship?
A second trend economists highlight is demographic transformations. By 2050, the world's population is projected to reach 9.7 billion people. But there are major regional differences. The UN projects that the population of sub-Saharan Africa is likely to double, while the population of Europe is likely to shrink. At the same time, people aged 65 and above are the world's fastest growing demographic, which is already posing a challenge in caring for this group in regions like Eastern Asia and Europe.
In terms of wealthy countries, you see an aging demographic where more and more of their working population is heading into retirement. But if you look around the world, particularly in Africa and Asia, what you see is a worker population that is growing into itself. Younger workers are becoming more and more a part of the prime working age.
Around the world, the average population age is trending higher, with the number of people over 60 expected to double by 2050.
There's 3 levels of infrastructure where you really see this worker shortage and an aging demographic come into play. It's the financial infrastructure. For example, there's not enough accountants. It's the care economy infrastructure. So there's not enough nurses and healthcare workers or even babysitters for the population. And then there's the actual physical infrastructure. So here you think about specialized trades or construction.
According to recent research, 63% of businesses say their most significant barrier to growth is the inability to attract the right workers. Richardson says making these soon-to-be in-demand jobs more sustainable and attractive to prospective workers is key to keeping workforces resilient even as more people retire.
And this is where skills and upskilling is going to be so important. Not just creating jobs and skilling workers in these specific areas, but allowing workers the mobility to progress in these areas so they won't leave. They won't leave healthcare or accounting jobs and go to more profitable places because they see advancement and potential in these areas.
Artificial intelligence, experts argue, will play a key role in reshaping these jobs, and many others. That's the third trend economists are watching closely.
Generative AI is making us rethink the concept of productivity. Usually we think about productivity, about producing the same with less or more with the same. I think generative AI is making us think that productivity is more like producing better with less.
Take AI agents, for example. They can be autonomous bots or even entire systems that can learn from their environment and help us, say, tick off the objectives on our to-do list without constant reminders. They have the potential to drastically improve our productivity or absolve us from certain tasks altogether. But these technologies should not lead to a loss of jobs. Richardson says productivity is also about companies providing the right upskilling pathways so that employees can grow their careers.
It's becoming even more important to be in a world where companies are invested in their talent, in human capital, moving from just managing workers to developing workers.
So where does that leave us with AI? Will it make us more productive at work?
There's a famous economist from MIT, Robert Solow, won the Nobel Prize for Growth. He was talking about computers in the 1980s. He said, we can see computers everywhere except in the productivity data. So it took a while for those effects to show up. It may show up sooner for AI. The view seems to be that the impact of the technology may be a bit more rapid than we saw for computers. But I think directionally, we're all pretty confident we're going to see some sort of improvement coming out of AI.
Generative AI could contribute $4.4 trillion annually to the global economy, reshaping industries and international trade as it develops. In a 2025 survey of businesses, 86% of respondents said AI could transform their work more than any other technology trend such as robots, semiconductors, or quantum.
It's not just about the great tech. You need workers to be able to incorporate that tech and actually become more productive. And if there is a chasm between the tech and the people, then you won't get the productivity enhancements that lead to a thriving labor force.
No expert can know for certain how these trends will change our societies, be it trade shifts, changes in demographics, or the rise of artificial intelligence.
We are rethinking the way our industries and sectors should be running. We are reimagining what the future will look like under a more sustained framework. I mean, these are big, big changes.
Understanding global trends can help all of us feel more empowered to tackle the challenges to come. That's where economics comes in. The World Economic Forum's chief economist community publishes their outlook 3 times per year, highlighting global economic trends and developments.
We have to make it more human, right? This is the making a prosperous society and a sustainable society and increasing the size of the pie and making sure the distribution is just, however we want to define that. That's sort of the language we should be speaking.
Lelaki penghantar makanan didakwa di Mahkamah Magistrate Bangi atas tuduhan membunuh seorang pemandu kereta lelaki dalam satu kejadian.
4 sungai di sekitar kawasan perindustrian Pasir Gudang di Johor termasuk Sungai Kim Kim didapati tercemar dan berada pada tahap yang membimbangkan. Kerajaan sudah mulakan inisiatif untuk menggantikan kenderaan operasinya kepada kenderaan elektrik EV dalam skala kecil terlebih dahulu.
Kenapa tiba-tiba aku rasa jealous dengan Kak Nur ni?
Cubaan memikat hati.
Kenapa abang nak orang macam Kak Nur?
Kak Nur tu cukup sempurna dah untuk abang.
Abang tak kisah Nur tak boleh balik dengan anak.
Abang tak kisah pun. Asalkan abang ada Nur, itu dah cukup.
Tapi Kak Nur kisah abang. Abang tolonglah dia.
Macam mana?
Gimana sanggup untuk jadi isteri nombor 2 abang?
Apakah takdir mereka? 1000 tahun, Rabu dan Khamis, 9 malam di Astro Ria dan Astro Go.
VUCA, VUCA. Kita melihat kepada aspek volatility, uncertainty, complexity dan ambiguity. Ini antara cabaran yang dihadapi oleh kebanyakan negara di dunia, khususnya negara di ASEAN, dan bagaimana untuk kita mengemudi perkara ini bergerak ke hadapan dan apakah cabarannya selaku konteks ASEAN. Dan dalam konteks yang sama, perbezaan antara geoekonomik dan geopolitik yang memaksa syarikat-syarikat untuk merangka semula segala strategi mereka dalam mendepani perbezaan ini. Apakah cabaran yang dihadapi dalam konteks geopolitik? Apakah cabarannya pula dalam geoekonomik? Itu perbincangan kita dalam ASEAN kita pada episod pada kali ini. Saya bersama dengan Profesor Rory Metcalf, iaitu yang merupakan Head of College ANU National Security College. Kita saksikan. Prof, thank you so much for joining Niaga AWANI. I want to ask about the current situation in a world of persistent uncertainty. How should business leaders, interpret in terms of today's strategic competition in this region especially, and not just as geopolitics, but geoeconomics?
So it's great to be here, and I'm sorry that it's such a confronting topic that we're discussing, because this is a really grim and challenging time, I think, for the region and the world. And, I come at this really as a security specialist. I look at economics through the geoeconomic prism, and I think your question is absolutely on the mark. That is, yes, we're in an era of geopolitical competition. In other words, states using power to seek advantage. But this has now translated very clearly into geoeconomic competition. That is, the power that states are using is every aspect of economic power. And we're seeing this most starkly in the tariff shock from the Trump administration, but there's a longer trend, I'd say over at least the past 10 to 15 years, where states have been using economics for strategic advantage. We've seen it in this region, including with the way that China has used its leverage, but we're now seeing, I think, very confrontingly, very starkly, that this dynamic is here to stay, and unfortunately this is the environment that business has to navigate in.
But all these countries, especially in ASEAN, adapt to this kind of strategy?
Well, I've certainly watched the way my own country, Australia, has been trying to adapt to this new reality, and we've had partial success over the past 10 to 15 years, but we've still got a very long way to go. Look, I think there's a paradoxical answer to that question, because at one level, of course, we want to attempt to let markets do their thing. I mean, there's been enormous benefit to this region from open economies, from free trade, really for decades now, and that's something that my country, Australia, has experienced as well. But we are also now in a world where, no question, states are using, especially big and powerful states, are using economic levers for state power, for political and strategic advantage. How well are we doing in responding to that? How good is the adaptation? I think it's pretty uneven. And I guess at one level, what we don't want to do is have the mutually assured destitution of immediately responding with our own tariff barriers. And I know there are questions about the level of tariff barriers within and by ASEAN countries. But at the same time, we shouldn't just leave this now to market responses. So I think that what I hope to see is governments in this region, including my government, Australia's government, conferring much, much more clearly and frankly among themselves as to how to coordinate our responses.
In ASEAN, we've seen different countries. Out of 10 countries, we often talk about whether we should lean towards the US or to the China. It's always these two countries.
Yeah.
But how do you see that ASEAN can strike a balance between these two countries? Because at the end of the day, most of ASEAN countries are open economy.
Yeah.
We really depend on our trade. With Trump in power, will it change the way we do things, we do business in ASEAN? And how do you see this, and how do we strike a balance with this?
Look, I think we need to get beyond the binary of China and the United States. Now, it's easy to say that when they are the two most powerful countries in the world, without question, and quite comprehensively. But, the Trump administration, for all of its, I think, mistakes and some of its, frankly, disgraceful behaviour, does talk about a multipolar world, and there's truth in that. So we are in a region, in an Indo-Pacific region, where there is multipolarity. Japan is very significant, the Republic of Korea, ASEAN economies themselves, Australia, the role of Europe. Don't forget Europe is a major trading and investment partner for the region. Yeah. So I guess my starting point would be to encourage ASEAN governments to do what the Australian government is trying to do, and that is to get beyond the binary, to look for a diversification of trade and economic partners, and not seek to make a total choice to say, well, we're going to put our entire economic future in the hands of either the US or China. Then, of course, there is the strategic and military story, which we can go into if you have time.
But sometimes it's quite hard to see clarity during turbulence in that sense. But how do you view that we can see clarity during turbulence and turn it into opportunity, especially for ASEAN region? For Malaysia, for instance, we are open country, right? We trade with the US, the China, European Union, and other countries as well. But how do we build clarity in a sense?
Look, I think a starting point is to go back to national interests, to determine what is it we're seeking to achieve here. And I think in each of our countries, interests relate to, obviously, stability, prosperity, the principles that underline our society and our political systems as well. And I think to seek that clarity, increasingly there's got to be a very direct conversation between business leaders and government, including the security community, the security establishment, to look at how we can voluntarily work together for national ends. Look, I think it's great that Malaysia is seeking to show leadership within ASEAN this year as chair, but no country can be a leader if they don't have clarity in their national settings first.
Okay, and I want to see, because when I was in the World Economic Forum, we've seen a lot of people were talking about, European Union, when Trump became the 47th US president, and the clarity isn't wasn't there and isn't there at that time. But in terms of ASEAN, with over 600 million population, relatively stable union in that sense. But how do you see this strength could be the enabler factor for ASEAN to move forward in terms of determining what future ASEAN should be in dealing with other countries and region as well?
Look, I'm glad you've underscored those quite powerful statistics, because you're right. If you look at ASEAN in totality, there's an enormous amount of agency there, and if you project that into the shadow of the future, let's go forward 20 years or so, as a proportion of the global economy, that's only going to grow. That's only going to be more important. And I think that if you look at that alongside others, and I would actually bring Europe into that picture to say, well, there's another economic pole there that if they can coordinate, if they can get that act together, can actually have agency in protecting the principles like free trade that are under such threat. So I think there's a leadership challenge there to seek to minimise differences, to harmonise national settings, and of course, as we know in ASEAN, one of the virtues and sometimes one of the problems of ASEAN is its consensus rule, the need to move slowly at a level that's comfortable to all participants. However, I think now is a time for, I guess, a reinvigoration of purpose there for ASEAN leaders to get together, and that depends enormously on the drive and the motivation of who's in the chair.
Yeah. If we talk about the difference between global north and global south, it's quite apparent in so many levels and backgrounds as well. But how do you see that business leaders, especially, trying to understand the whole situation? Because at the end of the day, they have to think about dollar and cents, their bottom line. At the same time, they have to understand geopolitics, geoeconomics, and the policies being introduced by particular countries, advanced countries in global north and global south as well, who's impacting by whatever happens in the global north. But how do you see the whole situation for business leaders and to implement at their company, for instance, and every day, because they are the one who's actually paying for all these jobs that we are hiring?
So look, from a business perspective, and again, I speak as a security guy, so there's something in common here, and that is, risk, really. It's really about anticipating and managing and mitigating risk. So these days, any self-respecting corporation is going to be relying on either geopolitical risk advice, either internally or externally, or preferably a bit of both, on every major decision. I think there's no place here for sentiment about whether a business organisation identifies with the global south or the developed world or some other bloc. I think this should be much more about those basic calculations of risk and stability. And unfortunately, for a lot of us who've seen the United States as the place of stability for many years, we're going through a phase where that's clearly not the case. That doesn't mean, of course, that we suddenly identify, China or some other location as the obvious pillar of stability. I think we're going to need to hedge our bets, diversify, and therefore, I think for business, it's having that very clear line of geopolitical risk advice and a willingness to look at the principles that uphold a stable environment in this region. What we don't need in this region now is, having had the economic shock of the Trump tariffs, to then face some kind of strategic shock, which would put all of our prosperity at risk.
When you talk about, countries in ASEAN, or ASEAN as a whole, should look beyond the existing trade countries that we are having currently, and the reality on the ground. For Malaysia, I can take from Malaysia for example. When we do more trade with China, a lot of people are concerned that China will dominate us. And at the same time, we have the issue of Gaza and Palestine, and we hate America in that sense, right? But how do we strike a balance? Because at the same time, we have the Indo-Pacific area as well. But how is the realistic, economic and also a strategic partnership should be struck by ASEAN and Malaysia as the chair for ASEAN in terms of the balancing act? Was it hard to achieve?
Well, I think, even taking a look as an outsider at the Malaysian economy, I mean, there is reasonable diversification there. You know, I mean, my own country, Australia, has a very large trade relationship with China, but we don't have a large investment relationship with China. Our investment relationships are much more leaning towards America, Europe, Japan, South Korea, etc. And so the diversification imperative, I think, is really number one. And other shocks, I mean, COVID, for example, I think taught us that lesson. In terms of the relationships with China, again, the Australian experience is we want a relationship that is predictable, that is stable, that's based on mutual respect, and where we protect our own interests. Now, you can have an economic relationship and still do all of that, but you need very clear settings domestically, including on issues like foreign investment, foreign interference and so forth. It is doable, and I think that Australia and Malaysia as middle powers in the Indo-Pacific can actually very constructively exchange notes on how this is done, and perhaps work with others to build that ballast of middle powers in the region, because so much of the economic weight and the economic potential of the Indo-Pacific is not purely located in Beijing or Washington.
I want to talk about from the security point of view, because when I went to AWS reInvent in Las Vegas for every year to talk about AI, the power of AI, and the same goes in during World Economic Forum, the power of AI. But all these technologies possessed by advanced countries, it's either US or China or other countries, but not from this region, ASEAN, and we are some sort of consumers in that sense for AI. But how do you see, in terms from the perspective of security, adapting to AI, because we don't want to be left behind, but we want to move forward with AI. Where are we for this region from your point of view, and how do we progress in terms of adapting AI and having its technology built from our soil?
Yeah, look, I think that is one technology, and it is an absolutely critical technology for the decades ahead. That is one technology where the choices do become starker, where I think multipolarity is less manifest. So, you're right, there is very much a US-centric ecosystem and increasingly a China-centric ecosystem. There are efforts to build other ecosystems, Europe, Japan, etc. I think the simple answer to that question is to say that we start needing to build national capability. So, for example, in Australia, at our universities, in our private sector, there's some reasonably impressive research in AI. The level of investment in that is generally not sufficient. I can't speak for the situation in Malaysia or elsewhere in ASEAN, but it would strike me that a first step is building the national base. A second step is ensuring that the legislation, that the legal protections in place are such that we can actually contribute to standards for how AI is developed and used within our countries, and there is an ethical dimension to that. And then when it comes to engaging with those big ecosystems, the US and or China or others, we can do it with our eyes open. I do think that if we go simply hell-bent for one ecosystem or the other without any national capability or national protections in place, then we are heading to a future where we're going to be diminishing our own sovereignty.
Navigating between the big brothers, for Malaysia especially, what can we learn from Australia? Because when we talk about navigating Malaysia as an open economy, we are always working closely with China and the US and the European Union, other countries as well. But what is the best practices that we can learn from Australia in that sense? Because sometimes there's always a taboo topic to be discussed in Malaysia. For instance, when in regards to Palestine, it's a no-no for Malaysia. But when it comes to our sovereignty, it's also a no-no for Malaysia. When we talk about 9-9, it's very sensitive in Malaysia. But what can we learn from Australia?
Look, we're learning too, so it's a great question. But I think this is where middle powers need to learn together and need to be very honest in the conversations of sharing what they've done right, what they've maybe got wrong in their experiments, and how we can work together. Look, I think from the Australian experience, there's obviously a perception that we've had this challenge over the years of engaging with the Indo-Pacific region while also being an ally of the United States. I think our governments have done a reasonable job of managing that balance. And so just to sort of give a couple of examples of how that's worked, I think the idea of actually working with, encouraging and building a multipolar Indo-Pacific region is something that Australia has very much supported and encouraged over the years. We've done a lot more with Japan, we've done a lot more with India, we've worked with Indonesia, we've certainly looked beyond the US-China binary, while also recognising the security benefits we get from the relationship with the United States.
Yeah.
I think it's also about having a willingness to speak very frankly, engage very frankly with those powerful actors. We've had frictions, as you know, in our China relationship over the years, but we've kept all of the national security settings that were put in place during that time while maintaining a more stable relationship with Beijing. So a lot of it boils down to the quality of statecraft, diplomacy and more, and I think that's somewhere where Australia and Malaysia should do more together.
Yeah. We've seen the new world in terms of economic trajectory and in terms of security, in terms of a lot of things and aspects as well. But a lot of countries are, still doing the same things of doing things and business and running the countries. But how do you see that the new reality right now have changed the way countries do things, especially in this region? Have they really, have thought about it and seen it and changed the way they do things domestically to improve themselves and to some sort of shield themselves? But do you see that this is going to be some sort of problem from this region if you are not there in terms of protecting your countries and also embracing the changes that's happening currently?
So whether we're looking at our region or we're looking globally, I think this is a time where small and middle powers need to effectively have a national interest strategy where they bring together all the elements of national power, the private sector, their security agencies and their non-security agencies alike, the strengths of civil society as well, and build really a much more coordinated national approach. You have to have that domestic resilience before you can engage as a useful partner with others. And so I wouldn't limit that conversation purely to what we do in our region, it's also what we do in the world, because although there's talk of the rules-based system being dead, there's still a lot to fight for there that has benefited countries like ours.
We've seen a lot of countries, especially the US, challenging the world body, ICC, ICJ, UN in that sense. And we've seen a lot of countries feeling hopeless. But how do you see that the middle power, such as from this region, should play an important role in balancing the whole situation?
Well, I think we need to be looking at creative middle power coalitions that are not purely of this region. So I think the relationship between ASEAN and Australia, but maybe ASEAN, Australia and Europe, Japan, Canada, there's actually quite a potent group of partners there, and it's very important that that bridges north-south as well. And it's going to be a set of coalitions that are not precisely the same on every issue. There'll be some issues, for example, where we can and should engage India as a partner, others where that may not be the case. But I think it's very important to be sending a signal that so many of our nations that have contributed to and benefited from the multilateral system over decades now are not simply going to take its diminishment lying down.
But do you think the global North understand global South better in terms of a lot of things that we try to implement? For instance, let's talk about ESG. Now, the standard that are being put that the global South should follow is as if it's very unfair for our economic growth trajectory. Yeah. Right? That's just one aspect of it. But do you think that the standard being put in a lot of things by the global North, for instance, is fair and also showing understanding from them towards a global South?
So it's always good to put this question to an Australian because we're in the South, even if some would identify us politically with the global North. But I think, to be honest, there's probably a lot of self-reflection at the moment in countries right across the spectrum. So looking at partners in Europe, for example, which have, I think, recognised, whether it's through all of the shocks from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, through to the shock that's now being dealt to them from the Trump administration's, frankly, abuse of its allies in Europe, there's going to be a lot of self-reflection about their priorities. And so I wouldn't be surprised if some of their diplomacy now revisits some of these issues in ways that are more sensitive to the very different circumstances of countries in other parts of the world. I think it's a fair and open conversation that needs to be had.
I want to talk about war a little bit, because those days we talk about war and military base, even now.
Yeah.
But then from this region perspectives, it's no longer about having greater military. It's about having the influence in technology, for instance, in chip making, in semiconductor, for instance. But how do you see this new age of war, having the technology, semiconductor and all that, will give you more influence, and at the same time being more powerful in the supply chain for a smaller country like Malaysia? But how do you see the whole situation in terms of security as well?
There are so many questions embedded in that. Look, I would say that some of the lessons that we've had, particularly of the Ukraine conflict in recent years, are that it is incredibly difficult for countries to wage war on their own. That they need that supporting, that enabling ecosystem. And even Russia, which seems such a formidable power in some ways, has ended up relying very heavily on China and others in its support for technology and logistics. I think when it comes to our region, to the Indo-Pacific region, when we think of the risks of conflict, and obviously the most pressing risk is the possibility of conflict across the Taiwan Strait, this is again true. I think even China, which has a view that somehow it could be an assertive military actor in a completely autarkic way, would very quickly find that if it came to a major conflict, there would be all sorts of economic dependencies that would come into play. And I think this is actually a very good argument against any country taking risk with armed conflict in our region, because the fundamental rupture to all of the economic supply chains of all of our countries would be quite immediate and quite devastating for all of our populations. Having said that, if we're looking to national defence, whether it's for Malaysia, whether it's for Australia, again, I think the view now is to look at how can we develop more capability domestically. We all, in my view, are going to see our countries increase defence spending as a proportion of GDP. We are, in my view, all going to see, I think, a much greater fusion of the military and civil infrastructure when we do that. But I don't think it's realistic for us to imagine that any of our countries can defend ourselves alone.
How important it is to have the military influence in this region? For instance, when we talk about China, so we should have US influence in the region via Philippines or Singapore, in that sense. But how important it is to strike a balance by having another superpower in this region, but at the same time having ASEAN countries' population who refused to be dictated by all these two major powers in this area?
So, look, an ideal vision for this region, I think, ultimately is one where it's very clear to major powers that military aggression does not pay. And I think that's why, from a global perspective, I think one of the tragedies of the situation in Ukraine is that we've seen military aggression. But in this region, I think we have understandably wanted a balance. We've wanted, as the Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong talks about, a strategic equilibrium where no country dominates and no country is dominated by others. That's much easier said than done. I think it is vastly preferable that the United States maintains a military presence in the region, but it does it in a way that is stabilising, not destabilising, and that goes, I think, in some ways to the quality of American diplomacy. I think at the same time it makes sense for, again, the small and middle powers to build up their own capability defensively, so that increasingly, if there were circumstances where we moved closer to the brink of the kind of conflict that would disrupt our region, small and middle countries could protect themselves, could help to deter conflict, could help to respond if conflict were to erupt. And I think all of this comes with the aspiration that over time, the major powers, and I think China in particular, will come to realise that making threats of conflict is not going to be good for really the well-being of their own development, their own population. Because I still have the hope that we can maintain equilibrium in this region for generations to come.
My final questions.
Please.
Are we on the right track for this region in terms of embracing ourselves for geopolitical tension and uncertainty and geoeconomic uncertainty of the world? Are we on the right track in terms of working beyond the existing countries that we work currently and having more strategic partnerships and all that?
So my advice, particularly to friends in ASEAN countries, would be please don't be complacent. I think we've had this risk in Australia sometimes in the past that we've been too complacent. We cannot hide from the woes of the world. We've got to contribute to maintaining balance in the region. I do think that there hasn't been enough use of ASEAN institutions to try to really do what they were set up for, and that is to maintain that equilibrium. So I think whether we're on the right track or not, the direction of travel has to be, I think, much more seriousness of purpose in using the architecture that we have.
Great. Prof, thank you so much for joining AWANI. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.